Okay, I'm Tom Huntley. I'm the senior editor here at the Pulitzer Center. And briefly, because I see some new faces here, a bit about the Pulitzer Center. We're a journalism nonprofit, now marking our 10th year. And what we do primarily is give grants to journalists to report on international topics of interest. We currently do about 130, 140 of these reporting projects each year. We also have an extensive educational outreach program that connects our journalists and their reporting with thousands of students from middle schools to universities. Our guest this afternoon, George Black, produced a wonderful story for the New Yorker on attempts to clean up the Ganges. And earlier today we had George out at Wilson High School and the DC International Charter School. I want to tell you a bit more about George. He's a New York City-based writer specializing in international affairs and the environment. He's Scottish.
I'm proud of it.
And he supports West Ham United.
Passionately, even though they've lost 4 of their first 5 games, and I don't want to talk about them tonight. Where did you dig that up?
I'm an anyone but Chelsea fan. So.
You've been doing your deep investigative research here.
So in his 35-year career as a journalist, he has written on a wide range of topics for a wide range of magazines, newspapers, digital publications, and is the recipient of numerous awards. He's also worked in television for the BBC, the CBC, PBS, and has also contributed to NPR. He's a former columnist for the Los Angeles Times and foreign editor of the Nation. For 10 years, until 2014, he was the executive editor of On Earth magazine, published by the Natural Resources Defense Council, a leading U.S. environmental organization. Since then, he has been a regular contributor to the NewYorker.com, Salon, The Guardian, The Nation, and other publications. George has also written some books. His most recent, The Empire of Shadows, The Epic Story of Yellowstone, was widely praised and was a finalist for the 2013 Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He is currently at work on a book about the history, culture, and environment of the Ganges, which is the topic of our talk today. And George will start with a bit of an explanation of his project, some slides to show you, and then we'll leave enough time at the end for your questions. George?
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Pulitzer. I won't embarrass everyone by saying what an essential organization the Pulitzer Center has become, and we could spend all night talking about how the kind of journalism they support is more and more and more essential, whether or not, and this is a whole second level to the conversation, anyone cares or reads it once we do produce it, and whether fact has any place in our contemporary world at all. We continue to believe it does. One of the other smaller gigs that I have as a journalist these days is very much directly inspired by the Pulitzer Center. I work as an editor-at-large. Not many hours, I wish I could give them more, with a wonderful group that is somewhat modeled on the Pulitzer Center model. It's called the Food and Environment Reporting Network, or FERN. And it's the same basic challenge that we try to deal with, which is that there's a critical need more than ever for in-depth investigative reporting. The media that used to generate this routinely largely no longer exists. The places that do continue to publish it don't have the budgets to make it worthwhile for reporters to do them. And so, like Pulitzer, we come in on a more modest scale, doing a couple of dozen stories a year, of actually making it possible for serious journalists to earn the kind of money, by which I mean ideally $2 a word, which may sound like a lot, but really for investigative deep dive work is not, and cover their travel expenses. And so the Pulitzer model has been very much on the minds of a lot of us for the 10 years since it was in existence. This story I think when people think of the New Yorker, they go, oh, the most prestigious magazine, they must have endless money. It's really interesting that the budget's everywhere. If you look at the New Yorker now compared to what it was a few years ago, this is the issue with my story. Look how thin that is. There's no advertising. Print advertising has dried up. The model isn't working. The online models are largely not working either. And so, this kind of work, this trip, these 2 trips that I made for this story, were fundamentally dependent on the New Yorker's funding being supplemented by the Pulitzer Center, and they've now worked together on several stories. I want to talk just a little bit about how I framed this story, what the discussions were with the New Yorker that framed it, what the particular challenges of it were. Because on the face of it, a lot of people have written for many years about the Ganges. A lot of people have described what an environmental catastrophe is. A lot of people have written about the religious connotations of the river. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to find a way of getting at the story that was different. And I think the challenge is, the sort of main question challenge that we tried to engage was this mystery of who this man is who is now running India, Narendra Modi. I remember vividly that when it was almost, I don't want to overstretch the comparison, but actually somebody raised it this morning, and it actually never really occurred to me in this way, that this teacher we met this morning at one of the schools was saying, she almost saw Modi as a precursor of what is happening with Brexit and with the right wing in Europe and with Trump, this desire for a strong man who can come in and miraculously fix all these intractable problems. And I remember in the lead up to the elections when Modi was elected 2.5 years ago, he was almost treated like this Trump-like figure. He was a pariah. He was a radical Hindu nationalist. He had been implicated in horrendously violent events when he was chief minister of the state of Gujarat. And in one notorious incident, more than 1,000 Muslims were killed after a Muslim mob had killed 59 Hindus in a train. And he was widely charged with either direct complicity or acquiescence, not taking any punitive action against the murderers. And that was his image. The man could not get a US visa for 10 years. He was denied a visa for the entire length of the George W. Bush administration. So I remember The Economist in the lead up to the election, about a month before the vote, which I was there in India as the campaign was underway in the city of Varanasi, the sacred city that Modi actually selected as his own parliamentary constituency. And The Economist had a front page picture on the cover where Modi is looking really menacing. And the editorial is saying this man is unelectable, he should be treated basically as a pariah. And then 6 weeks later, he wins this massive landslide victory based on promises of economic development, prosperity, cleaning up corruption. And The Economist has him on the cover again, and this time he's got a little smile, he's wearing a white shirt, he looks very benign, and it's, the savior of India's economy. And so when this story idea came up, and it took a long time, as you well know, it took a long time to get this sucker into print. It was commissioned in February of last year, and it was finally published in July of this year. And so we talked about how to frame this story and said, okay, rather than just a conventional horror story about the impossibility of cleaning this up, let's try to get at this question of who is Modi? What is he really about? Is he a modernizer who wants to do this sincerely? Is it a political move? A lot of his opponents say this is all about promoting the cause of Hindu nationalism. So that was the basic frame. So then you come to the difficulties of reporting this story. And anyone who's spent time in India, I think, knows that it is a singularly difficult place to work. Tom had a lot of experience there in earlier times, and it's a place that presents all kinds of challenges, and very briefly, just a microcosm of the first reason it took so long to get this story off the ground. So I got this assignment. I was sitting the end of February of last year in the Hanoi airport, I was waiting for a flight to Bangkok and checking my email, and up pops a message from Dorothy Wickenden, who is the executive editor of The New Yorker, although they don't actually have job titles because they're a very peculiar place. But Dorothy is a figure of some magnitude at The New Yorker. So she emails me and says, would you like to do a piece about the cleanup of the Ganges? And of course, yes, I'd love to. So we sit down, we talk about how to frame it. And she says to me at the end of the conversation, do you think Modi will do an interview? And I said, no way. He doesn't talk to the foreign press. He doesn't like to speak English. He takes a point of pride in not speaking English. Everything's in Hindi. I think to date he has still only given one real face-to-face interview that was with Fareed Zakaria on CNN. He also did a Q&A with, I think it was The Economist or Business Week maybe, but I don't even think it was necessarily done in person. And I said, there's no way. So she said, well, why don't you give it a try? I said, well, there's no harm in trying. So I called or emailed Alyssa Ayres at the Council on Foreign Relations, who is very knowledgeable, and I said, how do you think I should go about this? She said, oh, give a call to the consul in New York. He'll probably be very helpful. Long story short, I have a meeting with the consulate. Yes, this is a wonderful idea, fantastic, we'll do everything possible to make this happen. First of all, you have to go away and fill in this form. Which is always an ominous sentence in India. So I look at the form. I said, but this is an application to make a documentary film. Yes, we know, but that's the... I said, but this is a print story for a magazine. Yes, but you have to fill in this form. So there's like several forms. They're all basically identical and repetitive. And they include things like, I do hereby swear under penalty of oath that I shall hereby guarantee provision of all expenses, accommodation, and other facilities required by said government officials who will accompany me during reporting of said documentary, that I will further submit for the consideration of the Indian government copies of the documentary before it airs, and will hereby agree to incorporate all criticisms, comments, and this just went on, and I kept saying to them, but this is nonsense. I'm doing a print magazine story, nonetheless. So I fill in these forms. I send them in. Nothing happens. The reporting trip, remember we're now in March, so the reporting trip is planned for May. The reason it's planned for May is I'm doing a book on India. And the last part of it I had to report is on the headwaters of the river in the Himalayas. You can only get there 2 months a year. And the previous year I'd had these delays. I get there, set out with my translator fixer, the monsoon begins. 24 hours, all the roads into the mountains are wiped out. So I had to go back and do this. And it had to be done in May or June. So I scheduled it. No word from the consulate. Countless emails, countless phone calls, not returned. Finally, oh, the person you were dealing with is no longer with us. I'm the new person. Restart the process. And all the time I was locked in this, I couldn't get out of it. And I was like in this labyrinth of trying to get to Modi, even knowing that I would never get him. And I had sort of worked my way to the innermost circle of confidants that he brought in with him from Gujarat, because he only works with this like very tight circle of aides that he trusts. And I finally get his senior aide from Gujarat on the phone. Yes, very possible Prime Minister will see you. Why don't you come in January for the big bathing festival, the Kumbh Mela at Allahabad, and maybe he will find... I said, can you guarantee it? Well, no, not guarantee. And I said at that point, I'm sorry. I want to just pull out of this process, go for a normal journalist visa, like I always do. And it cost basically 6 months in the end. And I finally didn't get there until the middle of September, reported the story. So that's like India in a nutshell, and everything is like that. I mean, I love India, I love Indian friends, but it is infuriating. It is so hard. So, that's one problem. The message of that is everything in India, in my experience, depends on having a really good, locally connected fixer translator everywhere you go. I see nodding of people who have clearly been through this mill. And I've been very lucky over the years in finding such people. And they're invaluable. I mean, they get you the entrees, they get the phone calls returned. Although not even they. I mean, I had an interview promised, scheduled with the Chief Minister of the state of Uttar Pradesh, big political enemy of Modi. At the last minute, He just stops answering emails, stops answering phone calls, disappears, no interview. So those are frustrations. There are many other frustrations and challenges, because I did find, and I think managed to convey in the story, that Hindu-Muslim dynamics and tensions and historic conflicts along the Ganges have a huge role to play in the story of how you clean the river up, because first of all, India is a federal system. So you immediately have the problem that Modi's ruling party, the BJP, does not control the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is the heartland of North India. And essentially, I divide the Ganges into three segments: the mountains, where it's this beautiful, fast-flowing glacial river; the plains, which feed 500 million people and run through the most corrupt and the most socially disadvantaged areas of the whole country; and then the delta, which splits into Bangladesh and India. I'm going to leave the slides. I don't want to actually spend much time on photographs. But in the North Indian Gangetic plain, history and politics and culture and attitudes are so deeply informed by the history of Muslim-Hindu rivalries, antagonisms. I think a lot of people are actually surprised to learn that 20%, 18 to 20% of the population of that part of India is Muslim. And in South India, you find that coexistence between Hindus and Muslims is an entirely different matter, because Islam arrived on trade routes. It basically came across the Arabian Sea with traders, merchants. And in North India, of course, from the topography, if you look at this vast plain that stretches down through Pakistan into India, it's an invasion route, basically from Central Asia. And successive waves, starting in the 1100s, going through the 1600s, of Mughal invaders who set up, architecturally, culturally incredible monuments, poetry, architecture, but basically razed the temples in their paths, imposed rule by often very brutal means. And it's a very deep historic memory among a lot of Hindus, and a lot of the sort of irrational hatred does actually have historical origins which are worth thinking about. These things don't happen out of thin air. And so the Muslims over time became this minority, but they were a minority with one particular sector of influence, which reflects very interestingly on the history of the river, and is really, it's crucial to any reporting that's ever been done, and Pulitzer have supported other reporting initiatives on the Ganges that have also taken other reporters and photographers to the same place, the city of Kanpur. Kanpur is about as difficult a city in a country of difficult cities as you can imagine. It's a city of, people don't even know. 3 million, 3.5 million, 4 million, who knows? Big city, constant traffic gridlock, not a traffic light in sight that I ever saw. And it's the center of the Indian tannery industry. The reasons for which are really quite interesting, and I had no idea until I went there what they were. For the Brits, the Brits arrive in the 1600s, and they come up the Ganges. The Mughal invaders come down this way. The Brits come up here because they do a 3-month journey from London, or from Southampton, I guess, or whatever the port was, Plymouth. And they find this natural harbor in Calcutta. And they use the river as the key to the conquest and domination of India. They start a navigation route that goes all the way up from Calcutta to Allahabad, which is the confluence between the Ganges and its biggest tributary, the Yamuna, which comes through New Delhi and contributes a huge, catastrophic amount of pollution to the main river. So the Brits put down a very militant rebellion in 1857, the Mutiny, as the Brits call it. The First War of Independence is what the Indians call it. And they set up military controls in the state of Uttar Pradesh, in cities like Lucknow and Allahabad. Well, what's one of the first things that a soldier and a policeman needs? Holster to put his gun in, belt for his military uniform, boots, leather. you can't kill cows in India. So Hindus also don't like, for complex caste reasons, industries that involve slaughtering animals, blood. So the first leather industry ends up in the hands of Muslims. And it was like one of those things where suddenly this little bell goes off and you say, that is actually something I didn't know, something I haven't seen in other reporting, but let's go talk to the tannery owners. Because what people usually do when they go to Kanpur is they look at the downstream end. I mean, the filth that comes out of the tanneries is unbelievable. The production of leather involves the processing with chromium sulfate. And it produces a chemical compound called hexavalent chromium, which is a carcinogen, which is like one of the worst chemicals known. And about a third of the tannery waste is processed and cleaned, kind of. And about a third of the sewage of the city is cleaned, kind of. And the rest goes into the river, and some of it is mixed to feed irrigation canals that go down to the farm fields. And of course, those chemicals end up in the soil, in the water, in the food. But it's a Muslim-owned industry, and it's a very big and very influential industry, and it brings in a lot of money. I mean, this is a more than $2 billion industry. And when government regulators come in the kind of half-assed, if you'll forgive me, half-assed way they do to regulate this industry, there's a cry of religious persecution. You're picking on us because we're Muslims. They close down the tanneries every year. There's a huge, Modi's aide said, why don't you come back in January and he may find time for you at the bathing festival in Allahabad, the Kumbh, the Mela. Every year during the Mela, millions of people, Hindus, come to bathe in the river. And they shut down the tanneries. So the tanneries lose tens of millions of dollars during those weeks, and they resent it very fiercely, and they regard it as religious persecution. The Hindu militants regard it as the Muslims complaining again without cause. Apart from the tannery industry, the Muslims are really at the bottom of the economic heap in Uttar Pradesh, which doesn't mean necessarily that they are, this is beyond the scope of the story, but it's kind of an interesting little footnote to add. Varanasi, as you probably know, I mean, that is the spiritual heart of Hinduism. It's the great cremation grounds. It attracts a lot of tourists and kind of poverty porn, voyeur type tourism. It's a very, it's a stunning thing to watch and be present for. But actually Varanasi, in an odd way, even though it's a sacred Hindu city, has a sort of peaceful coexistence with its Muslim minority because of the way it has actually configured its economy. The main product of Varanasi is exquisite silk, high-quality silk saris. The sari stores and the sari wholesalers are Hindu. The weavers are Muslims, which is actually, I mean, to me, worth a story in itself for someone to do. And they sort of had a modus vivendi where there's a producer to retailer kind of link where everyone is in work, everyone has income, even though the life of a Muslim weaver is very, very impoverished and very hard. That's a tangent, but the other difficulty, I would say, in reporting a story like this, I mean, I think the Hindu-Muslim dynamics and the way that manifests itself in the conduct of the cleanup campaign, most notably the woman who was appointed as minister in charge of the campaign, as a political signal of one of Modi's agendas was very clear. He appointed a woman called Uma Bharti, who was one of the principal instigators of the worst incident of communal violence in India in the last quarter century, which was the riots that ensued when Hindu nationalist mobs in the city of Ayodhya, town of Ayodhya, which is kind of northish of Varanasi, northish of Allahabad on the river. Hindu mobs went there to protest the erection of Hindu mobs went to protest the erection of a mosque on the site that they had decided was the birthplace of one of the great gods, Rama. and they tore the mosque down. There were nationwide riots, 2,000 plus people killed. And this woman, Bharti, still faces today, because this is the way the Indian court systems work, multiple charges of incitement to riot, incitement to violence, incitement of religious hatred, etc., etc. So she's appointed head of this campaign. So you go, well, that's a pretty clear signal. And that's sort of reflected in the way in which, you know, the sacredness of Varanasi and the river is central to the political agenda of Modi. Here he is, he actually, as I think I said, chose Varanasi as his parliamentary constituency. There's this weird quirk of the Indian electoral system where you can actually decide where you want to run. It could be anywhere in the country. So he ran in Varanasi. This is the classic image of the Varanasi waterfront. And, you know, he announced the campaign by taking part in a prayer ceremony at the edge of the river, on the ghats, the steps that lead down to the river, and saying, my mother Ganga has called me here. So it's like a sacred mission. But I was going to say the other big problem in reporting a story like this is kind of shocking the more I think about it, and kind of why you come away from this story as depressed as I frankly did. I was talking to somebody earlier who was saying, we were saying that, you know, the normal way you report a story in a developing country with big problems is you find a microcosmic example of something that's working. You find somebody who's figured out, and I've done a lot of stories in India about energy, for example, where, you know, the government says we've got to build more power plants and hydroelectric dams, and a lot of people saying, you know, no, it's never going to work because the system is so incompetent, it's failed so many times. You've got to think micro, you've got to think local. So you do solar energy, you do biomass energy, you do whatever. And you can go to a locality and you can say, here's somebody who's got a business model that works. And there's no reason it can't be scaled up if somebody's prepared to put the capital into it, provide the bank loans, etc. I found what was so demoralizing about the Ganges is here you have a river that is 1,570 miles long. It is about, everyone would put it in the top 10, and some people would put it in the top 5 most polluted rivers in the world. It is sacred. It is considered to be a goddess, literally. And yet it is just an open sewer, literally, for large stretches. It is hideously polluted. And in the entire length of the Ganges until 3 years ago, I would say, without fear of contradiction, there were 2 serious full-time environmentalists on the river. There are NGOs in Delhi who do very good analytical work and public lobbying, but they're not connected to the river. I mean, I've written in the past about rivers in this country. I know a lot of environmental groups in this country. It's like every river, I'm sure you know, the Potomac, the Anacostia, all these, everything has a river keeper, everything has an NGO, everything has a local government that's trying in some way to enforce, you know, federal regulations, state regulations, Clean Water Act. And in the whole of the Ganges, this is really what you have. And one of those 2 people died 3 years ago. He was unique. His name was Veerbahadra Mishra. Everyone who went to India always interviewed Veerbahadra Mishra. He was unique because he was a scientist. He was a hydraulic engineer. He taught in Varanasi at the Banaras Hindu University. He was also a priest. He was the hereditary priest of the Sankat Mochan temple, which is dedicated to the monkey god Hanuman. And so he actually had a foot in both camps. He was a religious, observant Hindu. He took his holy dip in the river with all the pilgrims every morning. And then he'd go to New Delhi and he'd give TEDx talks and talk to scientists. And he had relationships with scientists in California who came to advise. But he passed away 3 years ago. And he created a nominal organization, and talking to people who worked with him directly, it was a one-man show. You know, he never created an infrastructure. He had a son who is also a scientist, also teaches at Banaras Hindu University, and is also the hereditary. Priesthoods are hereditary in Indian temples. I'm not sure all, but many important temples. It passes from father to son. He took on both mantles. He's a lovely man. He's smart, he's engaging, he's very concerned. He's not remotely what his father was. His father was a unique figure. And the reason why that sort of double-edged talent, priest and scientist, was so important is that the most fundamental problem of all, in some ways, in understanding how difficult it is to clean up the Ganges, is that the observant Hindu will say, how can it be impure?
Oh.
It's a goddess. And the whole function of that goddess in Hindu mythology is that she cleanses our sins. The creation myth of the river is that in ancient times, according to the scriptures, there was a king who had 60,000 sons. And the 60,000 sons were traveling in search of a horse. There was this old ritual called the Aswamed, which was the horse sacrifice, where a king would send a horse out to roam the territory, and wherever the horse went, that became the king's possessions, and if anyone resisted, they met their own fate. So this horse was lost and kidnapped by the gods in some fashion. So King Sagara sent out his 60,000 sons to find the missing horse. And they got all the way to the ocean, and they found a mystic, an ascetic, meditating on the beach. And they disturbed him in the midst of his meditations. So he shot bolts of fire from his eyes and fried them all to a crisp. So how did you expiate the sins of the 60,000 sons of King Sagara? You had to somehow cleanse their ashes. So the gods conferred about this problem. One of King Sagara's descendants, another king called Bhagivat, went to a rock near the source of the Ganges, stood on one leg for 1,000 years to try and propitiate the gods. And the gods said, that's pretty impressive, we better respond to this. So they said, well, how are we going to do this? We will bring the goddess Ganga down from the Milky Way, where she resides. So then they have a dilemma, because Ganga is known to be very hot-tempered and impetuous, and she's got this massive amount of water, and if she comes down to Earth, the force of that impact may destroy the universe. So Shiva, who is the preeminent deity on the river, worshipped everywhere on the river passionately. Shiva says, well, I have the solution to the problem. Shiva was famous for his long dreadlocks. And he said, if we bring the goddess down through my dreadlocks, they're so thick and matted that they will control her flow, and she can flow gently to the ocean, which is what happened. So when that is the religious view of the river, and then you go to Varanasi as your fondest dream as a Hindu, to break the cycle of birth, death, reincarnation by dying, being cremated, having your ashes immersed in Ganga, you break that endless cycle and you join your ancestors in heaven. How are you to persuade those people that this pure goddess can actually be impure? The way Birbhadra Mishra kind of addressed it was to say, she's our goddess, she's your mother, and you're defiling her. We have a responsibility not to defile the goddess. But it's a real hard sell. And those beliefs in the character of the river, and you see it in all the pilgrims who come to bathe. I mean, they duck in it 3 times, they dive underwater, some of them drink it, they take it home. It's a very difficult political challenge to get past. It goes much deeper than just, the Hindus and the Muslims are at war and the tanneries and so forth. Closing, the other full-time environmentalist is a truly wonderful man who, again, everyone goes to see because there's a limited number of people you can see who are authoritative. He's called Rakesh Jaiswal. And Rakesh began working in the tannery city of Kanpur in 1993, scooping up dead bodies from the river. He would go out periodically with co-workers, volunteers, and he said normally they pick up 100, 150 bodies in various states of decay. And sometimes they're people who just are thrown in by the police, sometimes they're people from lower castes who can't afford a cremation, sometimes they're Muslims, whatever. And it grew into quite a successful little organization called Eco-Friends. He got funding from the Ford Foundation, the World Bank, other international donors, and was really, a widely regarded, internationally respected figure. And after spending 2 days in the tanneries with Rakesh, I said, so what comes next? What's your next plan? And he just looked stricken and he said, I don't know. He said, I've given up. I don't know how to solve this. I don't know how anyone can solve this. And he talked a lot about, the obvious way that, as an outsider, you come to this problem and you say, how would you fix this? Well, you throw money at it. How much money do you need? And when I tried to research that basic fact, somebody who unfortunately I hope would be here tonight because he's the source of this, somebody who knows much more about India than I do, on an earlier art, Michael Thompson is his name. Once upon a time I did a story actually about the cremation industry in Varanasi and the wood mafia and how they encourage the cutting down of forests because the more wood you burn, the more pious you are and all this sort of stuff. And my fact checker got into all sorts of problems trying to discuss caste and gradations of caste in the cremation business. And he finally said, look, this is so difficult, can you just talk to this guy directly? So Michael gets on the phone and he says, George, you have to realize one thing, in India there are no facts. And it was kind of a weird thing to say, but then the first question I asked here, okay, Narendra Modi has dedicated $3 billion to this effort. How does that compare to how much previous governments have spent? So I looked at the figures that came from Rakesh Jaiswal's group, who had done an analysis of this, and they said $230 million over 30 years, which is peanuts. And I started looking for other figures, and I said, well, it's only one NGO. So I found other figures, 600 million. I found other figures, 6 billion, a billion. It was just like all over the place. So I thought, well, you go to government sources. So I found 2 reports from government. One was a cabinet report, interministerial report. The other was a report from the Central Pollution Control Board, which is like the EPA, except it has no enforcement powers, largely because the state governments, you can give them all the standards you want, but they're not going to enforce them. So these 2 official government reports issued in the same year. One said the total amount spent to date was $600 million. The other one said $2 billion, which kind of encapsulates really the deepest problem of reporting in India. How do you just establish the basic facts? So in the end, the way I'd wrap this up, this saga was with the New Yorker. The piece then went through a lot of delays because they were focused on election coverage and one reason or another. And the fact checker, the fact checking department of the New Yorker is legendary. They just go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. They really do, some people would say, re-report the whole story with you. So they were incredibly diligent. They found, thank God, the story pretty much stood up. There were not many significant mistakes. And it probably took the fact checker the better part of a month to do this story. And then the lawyers came in and said, look, you've got passages in here about serving government ministers who are subject to serious criminal charges. Have they commented? Have they rebutted? I said, look, I was not able to get to these people. I tried and tried and tried to get an interview. Well, the fact checker has to follow up. The fact checker sent 10 separate emails over a sustained period before we closed to Minister Uma Bharti, the nationalist who's in charge of the campaign. No answer to anything, no answer, no answer. He's framing these things, we're talking about it, he's saying, we are going to publish that you are accused of conspiracy to murder, incitement to mob violence. Is this correct? Because you can't find these records in the Indian court system. I mean, they have an ostensible online database of the status of cases. It's completely unusable, completely meaningless, out of date. You get the odd press report that says, Judge so-and-so has stayed the petition for whatever, and they drag on for years. And in the end, no one is ever prosecuted. There is one MP in the Indian Parliament. 1/3 of all the members of the Indian Parliament, upper and lower house, face criminal charges. I actually got a directory because everyone, when they run for office, has to declare any pending criminal charges against them. The one at the top of the list, who's from the southern state of Tamil Nadu, had 867 criminal charges pending. Uma Bharti only had 13, I think. But couldn't get an answer. So in the end, you just have to go with the best information you can glean and then get a third-party commentator who we got from a think tank in Washington. I don't even remember which one, to say, you know, these things never result in prosecution. So you put that line in, the lawyers are happy. But fact, gathering fact, checking fact at every level, I mean, I don't think there's anywhere in the world where it's as challenging. And in the end, you know, I hate coming out of a story feeling like I didn't find any grounds for hope here. And I just want to read you, you know, sometimes when you're reporting, and I'm going to finish, sometimes you see the ending of a story the moment it happens. I'm a great believer in not necessarily wrapping up a story with a summation, but finding a grace note to leave the reader with. And I found somebody in Varanasi who is kind of a very small-scale amateur environmentalist. And he called me up one day and he said, do you want to come out at dawn the next day to plant some trees? I'm going to go across to the other side of the river. And so we got up, we got a boatman to take us across to the other side of the river, which is very inauspicious. It's called Magar, and if you die there, you're reincarnated as a donkey. This is not a good place to kick off. So he brings these seeds of this tree, which has the reputation of drawing pollutants into its roots. And he had this dream that he said, we're going to create a forest of remembrance, a smriti, along this bank of the river. And I can see in the future, you know, it'll be this beautiful tree-lined area. There'll be walkways and people can jog. And he said grandparents can come here with their children. They look across at this beautiful waterfront, which is spectacularly beautiful. And it's kind of orange and red and yellow and brick. And it's just, I mean, it's amazing. He said, imagine people sitting here. And I said, yeah, but that's going to be a long time in the future, isn't it? And he said, yeah, but here's how he ended and how I ended the story. I asked him if he ever grew discouraged by the slow pace of change. He shrugged and said that all he could do was place his trust in Shiva. India is a land of discouragement, he said. If you're not discouraged by the harsh summers, then you're discouraged by the cow eating your plant, or the motorbike, or the tractor, or the car that is running over your plant, or the neighbor who is plucking the leaves from it just for fun as he is going by. If you can't deal with discouragement, India has no place for you.
Very, very uplifting. Thank you, George. We have some time for questions, and I have one about Modi, who is the son of a railway station tea seller, who says he doesn't speak English, which is unusual for a high official in India, who doesn't give interviews to journalists. But as you noted in your story, he seeks out the CEO of Google and Microsoft, who are both Indian-born. Does he see an alliance there, or what's the meaning of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I painted Modi as having this sort of duality between the Hindu nationalist and the economic modernizer. The other dimension to that is that he is really into technology and social media. He's politically a very adroit user of social media. I mean, he uses Twitter, he uses Facebook. He's brilliant at staging the former Minister of the Environment in the last government, who is one of these very urbane, Western-educated intellectuals that Modi really hates. You know, he said this man is the master guru of the photo op. And it's true that sometimes they're meant to be inspirational, and they kind of are. You know, he'll bring the cameras around and he'll take a shovel to start shoveling dirt off the steps in Varanasi. Or he'll take a broom to sweep the streets of Delhi and say, we have to clean this country, it's a disgrace. And I think he's sincere about that. The technology, I think he really, you know, what the technology is for is increasing the speed of broadband access, which is painfully slow in India, and equipping railway stations with Wi-Fi, which actually, given the importance of the railway in India, I mean, the railway really is the kind of neural system network of India's. You know, it's legendary. You've got to travel in India by train. It's an incredible experience. So the railway stations actually already, it's interesting, even like the last trip, or the last but one trip, I took a train from Lucknow to Varanasi. It was an overnight train. And the station was just alive with rats and monkeys, and it was completely foul and chaotic. But there were digital signboards, and there were very efficient announcements. And you know, that I think is sort of at one level how you actually really can achieve something transformational if you could install high-speed Wi-Fi at every railway station. And I don't remember if it was the Google deal or the Microsoft deal that that was directed at. But I think, you know, he does online conferencing where, again, you can be cynical, you can say it's for show, or you can think he's sincere. I tend to think it's a little bit of both. You know, the lack of accountability of public officials is a scandal in India. I mean, it's just a scandal. And that question about how much money is dedicated to something, well, how much actually gets there? You know, Rakesh Jaiswal in Kanpur, talking about money that had been sent to Kanpur for tannery cleaning, for sewage plant installation. He says, you know, if 30 to 40% of that disappears, that's not even corruption. I mean, that's just regarded as the normal cost of doing business. And he says sometimes it's 100%. Every penny goes and somebody writes it down as sewage plant completed. And they haven't done a thing. They've just pocketed the money. So I think, you know, Modi is very attuned to corruption. The previous government, a large part of the reason, I mean, people got sick of it because it was a dynasty. And again, not to overplay the connections, but it was kind of, you know, we're sick of Bushes and Clintons. You know, they were sick of Gandhis and Nehrus and this family succession that kind of owned the government. And I think, you know, the disgust at corruption by the time Modi was elected was enormous. And I think he, for all sorts of motives, yeah, he wants to do away with corruption. It makes the economy hugely inefficient. It slows down business. It messes up everything. And he now has these multimedia platform video conferences where he interrogates ministers and takes, you know, like citizens' letters. You know, Mrs. So-and-so of Pune complains that the new highway was supposed to bypass the city 6 months ago and it's still unfinished. Why? And the guy from Pune will have to sit and say, well, Mr. Prime Minister, you know, so I think he is using technology in ways that are, you know, creative and I think sincere, honest.
Questions?
Left them all speechless.
When's your book scheduled to be released?
Oh, God. My editor at the New Yorker, I met 7 years ago. I used to be his editor. And I said to him, so you're finishing this book? He said, yeah, I can't do enough for your magazine. I'd love to do more, but I'm finishing this book. A year later, how's the book going on? He says, well, I'm almost done. I'm on the last couple of chapters. So what's your book on? He said, he's a science writer as well as an editor. He says, it's on time. So this became like a standing joke between us. He just posted on Facebook this week a shot of him doing the final pencil edits on the final chapter. So this is 7 years. When is my book going to come out? I don't know. I mean, I'm just very busy with other things and I can't get to it. It's not a conventional book. It's not a travel book exactly, but it's a personal journey down the Ganges, and it's really exploring why this river is such a magnet to people, historically, contemporary. I mean, it really is everything from, you know, like encounters with Hindu priests to stories of Allen Ginsberg's visits to, you know, meeting a Latvian devotee of Shiva who's there for bungee jumping, you know, I mean, how everyone gravitates, you know, Israelis coming out of military service who go and have created the sort of drug culture. And it's just all these encounters strung together in the form of a journey. So I can sort of come back to it and drop it and then come back to it because they're short segments rather than sort of having to have your head in the same place for months at an end, which you normally have to do with a book.
How does India manage to sustain any economic growth with the kind of system?
How does it manage to?
Sustain any amount of economic growth with the system you describe?
Well, a lot of it in the last 10, 15 years has been IT boom driven. And we all got sort of very carried away in the West. You know, Tom Friedman wrote his great book, The World is Flat, Everyone's going to be the same, and everyone's going to be a successful capitalist economy. And he got very excited because he went to Bangalore, and, you know, the economic boom, and Bangalore is like no other city, and it's all gleaming new apartments and golf courses. So that was some of it. India doesn't have a manufacturing base, is really a big part of the problem. I mean, a lot of it is goods and services. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an economist, and actually I'm not really going to be able to give you a great answer, because they did last year outpace China for the first time, and they're growing at, you know, 7 or 8% a year. I'm not sure. I mean, you've covered India a lot. Do you have an answer to that?
Yeah,
Or?
I think it's like how they beat China was because of the quality of the product. I was in China for 2 months and I realized that like the products in China, in Beijing or wherever, like in South China, they're good enough for the people of China. But like outside, I didn't see a lot of people wanting those products. Like only now they've started exporting phones like MIs and whatnots, you know. But India in a way had an advantage because things like their products, like for example Tata trucks or whatever this sort of a thing, they have installed this hardware in other parts as well, like in Africa. Most of the utility vehicles, most of the military vehicles are supplied from India. So I think that's one place where we have an edge, is the quality of the product and how we are able to export that into other parts of the world.
That's really interesting, because, I mean, one thing you forget about India, it does have these gigantic industrial conglomerates like Tata. I was amazed. I was in England in April, and there was a big crisis in all the papers about the British steel industry. It's all owned by Tata. I mean, it's incredible, the reach of that corporation. And as you say, yeah, absolutely, vehicle production, yeah. Did you have it?
So, in addition to things like the tanneries, I imagine that there are, in addition to things like the tanneries, I imagine there's agricultural pollution from pesticides and fertilizers and such. But to what extent is just a lack of basic sewerage systems responsible? I mean, human waste, basically.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
household
human waste is the biggest single consistent visible problem. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of towns and villages along the Ganges have no sewerage. The cities that have sewerage generally are processing about 1/3 of the sewage output. That's the figure pretty much for Varanasi, Kanpur, Allahabad, the 3 main cities in that stretch, Patna.
That doesn't seem unfixable, though, somehow, or even politically. I understand there are cultural factors, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't think there'd be much political resistance to putting in these systems.
Yes and no.
But
I mean,
don't
no one
know.
has a resistance in principle, but here's the way it works, or has worked, and Modi is trying to address. Everyone knows this is like this egregious problem that has to be fixed. So they allocate a budget for the installation of a sewage system. Some of the cities present a particular problem. Varanasi is this labyrinth of tiny, narrow lanes. How on earth do you lay sewer pipes in that? So that's a technical challenge of an ancient city. It's a very ancient city. In other places, as I said at the beginning, I think, India is a federal system with very corrupt state governments, and one of the most notoriously corrupt is this state of Uttar Pradesh, which is where Varanasi, Kanpur, Allahabad all are. And it's ruled by a party that is deeply antagonistic toward Modi and is very corrupt. So you can allocate 10, 20, $30 million to a new sewage plant in Kanpur, in Varanasi. Is it going to get built? Where's the money going to go? What incentive is there for the contractor? And this is something they're now playing with as a technical level, which is they're paying the contractors in installments on the work's completion. In the past, it was like, here's the money, you give it to the state government, who gives it to the municipality, which hires the contractor, you know, and nothing happens. But, you know, there's this guy I mentioned, the priest scientist Veerbhadra Mishra, he said, you know, the whole emphasis on Western high-tech sewage treatment plants is misplaced. You know, there are other evaporation pond models and community-based models, and he had all these people from California. I always thought it was kind of pie in the sky. I mean, in the end, I think they are going to have sewage treatment plants. And you know, the reality is some of them will be built. I would think it's not unreasonable to think by the time Modi's term ends in 2 years, 3 years, there will be more sewage treatment plants than they were, and they're actually now, one of the stupid things about the earlier attempts to clean up the Ganges, and this is in the story from an interview with the previous environment minister, they would create plans for the capacity of the current population of cities, and of course the population growth of the cities is so fast, as soon as you build the plant, it's outdated. And then, there's levels of technical incompetence where the local government doesn't pay its electricity bills, so the plant shuts down. The work is shoddy, so it has to be shut down for repairs. I mean, there's so many layers of problems. Agricultural pollution, yeah. I mean, I think the guy who's under this Hindu nationalist minister, who's like the figurehead, I was very, very impressed by the career civil servant who's actually in charge of the overall day-to-day execution. Very serious guy. He's a former head of the equivalent of the EPA, the Central Pollution Control Board, very serious. And he said, part of the problem is everyone thinks Modi is a Superman. And he's cultivated that image, like, trust me and I'll fix it. I mean, it's almost Trump-like, it really is. I'm the one who can do it. So the bureaucrats are like, well, Mr. Modi is Superman, he's going to do it. Well, he's not. But he said, even if everything in the plan goes according to schedule, you're still left with the fact that, there is a massive hydropower dam up in the Himalayas that completely distorts the flow of the river. You've got hundreds and hundreds of miles of irrigation canals that were built by the British to control a famine in the 19th century, which deplete the river of an enormous amount of its natural flow. You not only have to deal with the Ganges, you have to deal with the Yamuna, which is its main tributary, and it comes through the city of Delhi, population 15, 16, 17 million, and is as black as your jacket. That river is unbelievable. So you've got to deal with that, and then you've got to deal with the fact that you've got 500 million people reliant on this, as you say, using pesticides, insecticides, fertilizers that are grossly polluting. He said the problem of discouraging the absolutely profligate use of water, because people are using primitive techniques, they're not being educated in water conservation, the water table is collapsing beneath the Gangetic plain. He said, even if we achieve everything in our plan, those things, you can't take down the dam, you can't unbuild the canals, and educating farmers to use water wisely, he said, you're talking decades. I mean, it really, which, as I say, I don't want to be depressing, but it is why you do sort of come away from this story being quite depressed, because it is such a gigantic task.
Okay. So I just had a question that applies more to your book and the people you met. Would you say that you found that they are that they identify as being in distinct groups, whether it's religion or caste or class, or did you find that some people feel conflicted?
Conflicted about their identity vis-a-vis the river? Well, you actually find, it's funny, when you talk about a priest, for example, I think we have a notion of what a priest is. It's a religious person. They do the temple. There are a lot of priest businessmen. There are a lot of priests who are very secular in their everyday activities. I mean, there was this, when I went to the Himalayas in May, on what was supposed to be the main reporting trip and ended up just being the Himalayas, there was a whole section of the story which actually was left on the cutting room floor because it was too long. But I met a businessman priest there in one of the most sacred of all the cities, Uttar Kashi. One of the interesting things about the Ganges is that two of the most sacred places are defined by the fact that the river turns to the north, and one is at Varanasi, and the ancient name for that is Kashi in Sanskrit, and then Uttar Kashi means the Kashi of the north, and which is now reputed to be the actual home of Shiva. That's where he lives. And this guy was incredibly secular and kind of, I mean, forgive my language, he said at one point, and this was in the story and got cut, he said, we're living in the age of the demon Kali, the Kali Yuga. And, there are 4 ages in the history of mankind, and we descended from virtue into vice, and this is the age of filth and mud and immorality, and I said to him, how long is it going to last? And he did all these calculations on his computer and all these ledgers. He said 432,000 years. So he grinned and he said, so we still have some ways to go. He's also the president of the Hotel Association. He runs a tourist complex for pilgrims. He's a trekker, he's a skier, he's a photographer. He's like, people do wear very different hats. The very militant Hindu priest that I interviewed, who is in the story a little bit toward the end, ranting about Muslims, he's a public school administrator. His brother, who is equally rabid about Muslims, works for Abbott Pharmaceutical, which is actually this company that was just exposed in the New York Times about a month ago for driving workers to suicide because their production standards are so demanding. So, people do wear different hats. It's not like the priests are holy men, and the priests in the cremation business who do all the sacred funeral rites at Varanasi are completely corrupt. They're pocketing money. It's a very, corruption is so, am I distorting the picture?
It's the best way to take people's money.
Yeah.
And even a temple is an investment. It's like a small business.
Yeah. You visit a temple and, you circumambulate the idol, the god, whether it's Hanuman, the monkey god, or Ganesha, or Kali, or Saraswati, or Lakshmi, whatever. You go in, you buy an offering. You deposit the offering on the statue of the god. And there's a guy sitting behind the statue slinging them into the back room to be recycled for the next bunch of suckers to come in. And, it's... So yeah, people are conflicted in that sense. Am I a businessman? Am I a priest? Am I a criminal? I'm all sorts of things.
I think we have a question here.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Oh, thank you for your reporting. I think I was most mesmerized as you talked by your beautiful retelling of the Hindu mythology and that story. And it really was, I could understand why it's captivating. Is there any place in the reporting to really talk to a scholar of Hinduism or a religious studies scholar to understand that better and to make, because it seems to me otherwise you run up against, oh, if only these people weren't so stupid,
I think the myths are beautiful and wonderful. One thing Hinduism, I realized years ago I was never going to understand this religion. It is so, you grow up in a monotheistic tradition, whether you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, 330 million gods.
Wow.
Or you ask somebody else, well, no, 330 gods. Where do you start? And every version of the myth has 50 variants, depending on which of the Vedas, Puranas, whatever source.
What region?
Yeah, what region, who's doing the oral history transmission.
All the more reason not to be to avoid being dismissive. Why not talk to someone who...
Yeah, the beauty of Hinduism is the diversity and the fact that there is no central authority, and therefore you can cherry pick whichever version appeals to you, whichever god or goddess you want to worship. And the danger to me of Hindu nationalism is the desire for an orthodoxy, to have a politically imposed orthodoxy that this is true Hinduism. And you see that a lot these days. A lot of what the ruling BJP party is about is the desire to have a political orthodoxy that is backed by a theological orthodoxy. And when I was there 2.5 years ago,
that was the only state that wanted when the rest of India wanted Hindi as a national language, even for legislation, for judiciary, everything. And Tamil Nadu was the only state that wanted English to be, because they were the only state, frankly, that has a language which no one else speaks. They are the only state in India out of the 27, 28 states that does not abide by Hindi. But what happens is when the country, if the country had a common language, a lot of things, a lot of history would be eliminated in a way, like, because a lot of these stories, a lot of these myths have reached this stage, have been recorded in their language. Like, for example, the Ramayana, which is the Hindu mythology. The version in the south, because it's in a different language, the implications are very different. Each language interprets it in a different way, because as you know, a language has a great effect on what the interpretation is. Like, something you would write in English and something you would write, like, that's one reason why Modi doesn't speak in English, because he is not nearly as effective when he speaks in English. If you quote him as an English speaker, he is, like, you won't respect him. Like, he's an enigma when he speaks in Hindi. So I actually support his decision to not speak in English, because he would just be a weak speaker. He'd be like someone on the street over here could speak much better than him in English than Modi could do. So I felt like retaining your language from the region you come from, I think it's a huge part of your identity. And if you lose that to a common language, you will lose that diversity in India, and that is something you wouldn't be as fascinated about India if that was.
No, you would lose a lot if everybody spoke the same language.
Definitely.
But it might be. I mean,
Easier to.
the different languages might make it more difficult for people to.
See, in India, such a place, even if they had a common language, it would be in a very similar situation. It's not like it will make it any easier, because a lot of what holds us back is our own attitude, in a way. Like, we love our religion, we love our country, but when it comes to, there are a lot of things that hold us back. It's a lot to do with, there in India to function, because it's so hard, because it's like, in India to do well, you have to really cut corners, and you have to take shortcuts, and you have to pay off a lot of people on the way. So it's so hard for everyone that, that's not even a consideration, we would never even think of. I'm sorry, I'm digressing, but.
One more.
Yeah.
No, I just add to
Yeah.
that, if you don't mind.
Please do.
So I agree with everything that you've been saying about language being so much of people's identities, and I think the sense of organization you're talking about, it goes beyond language or disorganization. I mean, obviously, if you lose regional identities, you lose the sense of diversity, as he was saying. But you couldn't get people to agree on one language, and then that's just fixing the language. I think it's one of those, it feels like an idea that would work, but the way the country works, it's beyond sort of linguistic barriers.
The only thing I would add to this on language is I think a lot of people believe that probably because the Indians we encounter here or in Europe speak impeccable English, people assume that it's a bilingual country. And I think the figure for how many Indians speak English is something like 12%. Between 10 and 15%.
I think about 20 to 20.
Is it really that high?
Yeah.
I thought I'd seen figures in the low teens. Well, you know more than I do, but it's a minority, a distinct minority. And it's very much an inherited colonial language that has passed as the lingua franca of the country. But
it is a very multilingual. I mean, if you go to individual cities, on the one hand, yes, people from the north can't communicate with the people in southern India, but then it's remarkable how multilingual each population is, because they may not be able to speak English and Hindi, but usually in most cities, each person can understand languages in the neighboring 3 or 4 states. So it's just, in fact, I cover science oftentimes, and I've covered language research, and there are researchers who study bilingualism and multilingualism that go to India to study it because it gives them a unique setting. And people don't learn the different languages in schools necessarily. A lot of people who aren't even educated, who don't even go to school, are speaking 3 or 4 languages. And it does actually, I would say, on the one hand, where language is a barrier in communication, on the other hand, there are plenty of, like, being multilingual as ordinary Indians are, it makes them very mobile and opens up a lot of economic opportunities for them.
One thing I actually found very interesting in North India and Uttar Pradesh is how, despite all the antagonisms, how many people have both Hindi and Urdu. Even though Urdu is the language of the Muslim community, a very considerable number of Hindus speak Urdu and vice versa.
Urdu is a mix of Persian, Hindi,
Right.
and Arabic, so there is a natural overlap.
Right.
And, yeah. And Bollywood is a great, equalizer.
Most of the big actors are Muslims. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think there's a bit of drink still left. We can finish the conversation out in the reception area.
Yeah.